The cold wind howled through the cracks of the cabin, biting at Lori's skin as she sat alone in the dimly lit room. Christmas Eve had come, but the holiday felt far away, like a memory from a life she no longer recognized. Outside, the snow piled up thick and heavy, as if the world itself was trying to shut her in. Her father's cabin stood still, creaking under the weight of time and neglect. The fire in the hearth had burned down to nothing more than a few glowing embers, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. Lori's fingers curled around a piece of woolen cloth, the warmth of the last embers doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. She felt cold, not just from the winter, but from the loneliness that had crept into her life after her father had passed. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was supposed to be able to stand on her own, to keep the land she had worked so hard to hold on to. But the legal papers, the judge's words, and the growing list of problems she couldn't fix weighed down on her. With each passing day, it felt like she was losing more than just the land. She was losing a piece of herself, too. The house was falling apart, and with it, the last ties she had to her family. The only thing left was the land, her father's land, but without legal papers, even that was slipping through her fingers. Sitting there in the silence, Lori's mind drifted to the memories of the years she had spent working the fields, of her mother's laughter in the kitchen, and of her father's steady hands fixing fences. She missed them all, more than she could ever put into words. They were gone, and now, it seemed, the land would be gone too. And what would she have left then? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Lori's heart skipped a beat. Who could be out in this storm at this hour? She stood, the cold floor biting her feet as she crossed the room. For a moment, she considered not answering. After all, she had no one left to share her troubles with. But something made her open the door. Standing there, framed by the darkness of the storm outside, was a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from stone. His hat was low over his eyes, and his coat was dusted with snow. But what caught her attention most was the steaming mug in his hand. He didn't speak immediately, just held it out to her. "Thought you might need this," he said, his voice low but steady. "Coffee. It'll warm you up." Lori blinked. Her first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want anyone's pity, especially not from a stranger. She didn't trust people, and she didn't need help. But something about the way he stood there, calm, unbothered by the storm, made her pause. She was cold, tired, and the idea of a little warmth was tempting. For a moment, their eyes met, and there was a strange silence between them. The kind of silence that hung in the air like something unspoken, something important. Lori didn't know why, but she found herself taking the cup from him, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. The man nodded, but didn't move to leave. Instead, he took a step inside, as if he belonged there, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't the type of person to be uncomfortable in silence. Lori didn't know what to say next. She was unused to kindness, especially from someone like him, someone who didn't seem to expect anything in return. The warmth of the coffee spread through her hands and up her arms, melting some of the cold from her bones. It wasn't just the drink that warmed her. It was the unexpected gesture, the simple kindness that seemed to be in such short supply these days. "Are you from around here?" Lori asked, breaking the silence, though her voice sounded unsure. She wasn't used to small talk with strangers. He nodded. "I am. Thatcher Boone." He didn't offer a handshake, just a brief acknowledgement of his name, as if it didn't matter. He wasn't here to impress her, and that was something Lori appreciated more than she realized. "Why are you here?" Lori asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. She didn't expect him to be so upfront with his answer, but she couldn't help it. Thatcher glanced at her, his expression unreadable, before his gaze shifted to the fire. "Thought you might need some company," he said quietly, the words simple, but there was a certain honesty in his tone that caught Lori off guard. She wasn't sure why. But the idea of company, real company, felt both foreign and comforting. She didn't have much left to offer anyone, but the thought of someone sitting with her, even for a moment, was more than she could have hoped for tonight. Lori didn't ask him to stay, but she didn't ask him to leave either. She simply sat down by the fire, her fingers still wrapped around the mug, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The storm raged on outside, but in that moment, the cabin was quiet. Just the crackle of the fire and the steady presence of a man who had no real reason to be there, except that he cared enough to offer warmth. Not just in the form of coffee, but in the simple act of showing up when no one else would. And in that quiet, with the wind howling outside and the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth, Lori felt something stir deep inside her, a flicker of hope. She didn't know where this strange meeting would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But that thought was a dangerous one, wasn't it? To hope. The next few days passed quietly, but something between Lori and Thatcher shifted in that brief moment by the fire. They didn't talk much after that night, but Lori found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. Thatcher had offered nothing but simple kindness, and in a world where everyone seemed to have their own agenda, that had been rare. Yet, as she worked the fields alone, the weight of her situation never lifted. The land was slipping away from her, and despite all the hard work and blood she had put into it, it felt like no one cared. Thatcher, with his gruff exterior and quiet nature, seemed so different from the men who had come before him. He didn't ask for anything in return, but the way he watched her, the way he didn't shy away from offering help, made her uneasy. She wasn't used to people caring without strings attached. Thatcher wasn't like the others in the town, the ones who only spoke to her when they needed something or when they saw an opportunity to take advantage of her independence. It was a strange feeling being looked after without being judged, without being told that she couldn't do it alone. But Thatcher didn't expect her to change, and that was what made him different. He respected her strength, and maybe that was what drew her to him. Yet, she couldn't fully trust him. She had lived her life fighting for what she had, keeping everyone at arm's length. Thatcher had offered her coffee, and now, it seemed, he was offering more. Still, she couldn't let herself fall for his kindness, because it would mean letting go of the last thing she had left, her pride. But Thatcher wasn't in a hurry to change her mind. He seemed content to stay quietly in the background, offering a hand when needed, but never pushing her to accept more than she was ready for. One afternoon, after finishing her work, Lori found him leaning against the fence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't greet her immediately, just stood there, waiting for her to make the first move. When she finally walked over, he looked down at her and spoke in his usual calm, measured voice. "You're still fighting, aren't you?" Lori hesitated, unsure how to answer. She wasn't used to being seen so clearly, to having someone know her struggles without asking. She shrugged, trying to brush off the truth, but Thatcher didn't let her. "You're not alone in this, Lori," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to do it all by yourself." It was the first time someone had said it so plainly, and it caught her off guard. But the truth of his words settled in her chest, heavy and undeniable. Lori didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the land, the fields stretching out before them. It had always been just her and the land. She had never known anything else. But as Thatcher stood beside her, quietly offering his presence, something inside her began to shift. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. The walls she had built around herself, the walls that had kept everyone out, were beginning to crack. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Thatcher's quiet patience, his respect for her independence, had started to break through the walls she had spent years building. And though she didn't fully understand what it meant yet, Lori knew that this moment, standing beside him on the edge of the land, was a turning point. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, things were changing between them. But the question was, would she allow it to? The following week was colder, the winter biting deeper as the days shortened and the nights stretched longer. Lori found herself thinking more and more about Thatcher. She couldn't explain it, but the presence of the man who had quietly entered her life was making a mark on her heart. She saw him every day, quietly working the land when he could, making sure the fence lines were steady, and even offering to fix things she never asked him to. He wasn't doing it out of pity, she realized. He wasn't trying to save her. He was simply there as steady and consistent as the land itself. And for some reason, it made her chest tighten in a way she wasn't prepared for. But still, there was the land that had once been her father's pride, that had witnessed the sweat and tears of generations, the land that now stood in jeopardy. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she toiled, the legal system was clear. Without the proper papers, without a deed to the property, it was just a piece of vacant land up for grabs by the highest bidder. And that bidder, Lori knew, was Thatcher's neighbor, Boone, a wealthy rancher who owned the land next door. Boone had been eyeing her father's land for years, and now, with the legal ruling against her, it seemed like he would finally get what he wanted. The worst part was, Lori had no way to stop it. She had no lawyer, no money, no one who could help her fight the land grab. It was all slipping away, and all she had left were the memories of her father, the blood, sweat, and tears they'd both poured into that land. One cold afternoon, as she walked back to the cabin from the field, Lori saw Thatcher standing near the gate of the property, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind. He was looking at something in his hands, a few sheets of paper, and when he saw her approach, he tucked them away quickly, as if trying to hide them. Lori stopped in her tracks. Something about the way he acted made her uneasy. "What's that?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Thatcher didn't answer immediately. He shifted on his feet, avoiding her gaze. Finally, he met her eyes, his expression unreadable. "It's a contract," he said quietly. "I need you to read it." The words caught her off guard. Lori furrowed her brow. "What kind of contract?" she asked, taking a step closer. Thatcher handed her the papers. She glanced at them, scanning the text quickly, her heart sinking as she saw the familiar words of legal jargon. It was a marriage contract. Her mind raced. "What is this? Are you trying to make a deal with me?" Lori's voice was tight, her chest tightening as the realization hit. "No," Thatcher said, his voice steady. "I'm offering you a chance to keep your land." Lori's head spun. The land, her father's land, was slipping through her fingers, and here was Thatcher, offering a solution she wasn't sure she could trust. The deal was simple. He would marry her legally, and the property would remain under her control. He wasn't asking for her love. He wasn't asking for anything but a legal arrangement that would keep Boone from taking her father's land. "I don't need your pity," Lori snapped, stepping back. "I didn't ask for your help." Thatcher's eyes were hard but calm, and for the first time, Lori saw something different in them. He wasn't looking at her with pity or judgment. He wasn't even looking at her with desire. He was looking at her with something else, respect. "It's not about pity," he said, his voice low. "It's about giving you a choice. You don't have to fight this alone, Lori." Lori stared at him, her mind racing. She had never considered a deal like this, never imagined marrying out of necessity. It felt wrong, like a betrayal of everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. She wasn't the kind of woman to marry just to save her land. She had always fought her own battles. But then again, she had always fought alone. The idea of doing it with someone else, someone who saw her strength and respected it, was something she had never allowed herself to consider. "I don't need you to save me," Lori said, her voice tight with the weight of her pride. But Thatcher didn't flinch. He simply stood there, unwavering, waiting. "You don't need me to save you," he agreed. "But you might need me to help you keep what's yours." The words hung in the air between them, and Lori could feel the weight of them pressing down on her. This wasn't about love. She knew that. This wasn't about a future together, about starting a family or building a life. This was about survival, about holding on to the one thing she had left, her land. And Thatcher was offering her a way to do it, a way that didn't require her to do it alone. Think about it, Thatcher said, his voice low. You can keep your land, Lori. You can keep everything your father worked for. You don't have to lose it all. Lori was silent, staring at the contract in her hands, the weight of it heavy in her palms. She knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't keep fighting this battle on her own. And maybe, just maybe, this was her only way out. She looked up at Thatcher, her expression hard but resolute. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for my land, for my father, for me. Thatcher nodded, his face unreadable. That's all I'm asking. Lori turned and walked toward the cabin, the contract still in her hand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the threshold, the reality of what she had just agreed to settling in. She had just signed her life away, not out of love, but out of necessity. She had chosen survival over pride, and that, she realized, might be the hardest choice she had ever made. But it was the only choice she had. The days after Lori and Thatcher's quiet, legal marriage were filled with a mix of awkwardness, tension, and the dawning realization that they were now tied together, not by love, but by necessity. Lori threw herself into the work of the land, as she always had, but there was something different now. It wasn't just the weight of the land itself. It was the weight of the contract, of her own choice to hold on to something that had once been purely hers. Thatcher, meanwhile, remained a silent, steady presence. He didn't ask for much from her, only that she allow him to help when it was needed, but even that felt like a strain on her already fragile pride. The house felt crowded in a way it hadn't before. There were no more moments of solitude, no more long evenings spent by the fire, just Lori and Thatcher, sharing a space but never truly sharing a life. At first, Lori tried to keep him at arm's length. She was used to being alone, used to managing everything herself, and the thought of relying on Thatcher, someone she barely knew, made her skin crawl. But Thatcher didn't push her. He helped around the farm, quietly mending fences, checking the barn, and doing the work that needed to be done without expecting any gratitude. He never tried to take over. He just was. His presence was constant but unobtrusive, like the steady rhythm of the seasons. Lori began to notice the small ways Thatcher cared. The roof that had leaked for years was finally patched up, not because she asked for it, but because Thatcher saw it needed to be done. The old well that had run dry for months was being dug deeper without a word from her. Even when she didn't ask for help, he was there, quietly doing the work that made the farm livable. And though Lori resented it at first, she found herself accepting his assistance, not out of need, but because she couldn't keep up with everything alone. But Thatcher didn't just fix the house or tend to the fields. He also started to fix something inside of her. It wasn't a grand gesture or some sudden shift. It was the way he would stand beside her, never saying much, just offering a quiet presence, letting her have her space while still being there. In time, she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone before. There was something about Thatcher's calm that settled the storms inside of her. He didn't judge her for her pride, for her stubbornness. He didn't try to change her, didn't tell her she was wrong for wanting to do it on her own. He simply accepted her for who she was. And that, more than anything, started to break down the wall she had built around herself. She started to trust him just a little. One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, Lori found herself sitting beside the fire, watching the flames flicker in the hearth. Thatcher had gone off to check on the livestock, and for the first time in a long while, Lori didn't feel the heavy burden of loneliness. The quiet had settled over the cabin, but it wasn't the oppressive silence she had been used to. This silence was different. It was peaceful, almost comforting. Thatcher had done nothing to earn her trust, nothing to make her open up to him. But there was something about his quiet, dependable nature that made her feel safe. She couldn't explain it. She wasn't sure she even wanted to. But the truth was, she was starting to care in small, unnoticed ways. That night, when Thatcher returned, he found her at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. It was the first time she had cooked a meal for both of them. She didn't say anything as he entered, but he gave her a nod, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that made her chest tighten just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They sat down together at the table, eating in silence, the soft clink of the utensils the only sound in the room. For a long while, neither of them spoke, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just the two of them, simply existing in the same space. Lori realized she didn't mind it. It was different from the solitude she had known, but it wasn't bad. It wasn't as lonely as it used to be. The days that followed were more of the same. Thatcher worked alongside her in silence, never pushing, never demanding anything in return. He didn't need to be thanked, didn't expect anything from her. He was there, and that was enough. But Lori knew she was starting to change. She wasn't sure when it happened, but slowly, the walls around her heart began to crack. The more she saw of Thatcher's quiet strength, the more she felt a shift inside herself. She wasn't just relying on him for help anymore. She was starting to see him as more than just a man she had made a deal with. He was becoming someone she trusted, someone she needed, and that terrified her. She had never needed anyone before. She had built her life on independence, on doing things on her own. But with Thatcher, it was different. He didn't make her feel weak for needing him. He didn't make her feel like a burden. He just was. And somehow, that made her feel stronger. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close to it. Lori didn't know how to name it. She didn't know if she ever would. But she knew that the days of feeling alone, of standing at the edge of the world with no one beside her, were slipping away. Slowly, but surely, Thatcher was becoming part of her life, and that scared her more than she cared to admit. She wasn't sure she was ready for that, but somewhere deep inside, she knew it was already happening. Thatcher had become a constant in her life, and she didn't know how she had gone so long without him. As the weeks went by, Lori found herself wondering what would happen when the winter ended. What would happen when the snow melted, the days grew longer, and the land was ready to be worked again? Would Thatcher still be there? Or would he leave when the deal was done, when the legal papers were signed and the land was hers once again? Lori didn't want to think about it. She didn't want to face the possibility that he might leave. Because somewhere, in the quiet moments between the work and the silence, she had begun to realize something she wasn't ready to admit. She didn't want him to go. The winter storm arrived without warning, a sudden fury that ripped through the land with howling winds and sheets of snow that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. Lori had been out in the fields earlier, tending to the livestock and making sure everything was prepared for the cold nights. But now, as the storm settled in, the reality of being stuck in the cabin with nowhere to go and no one to talk to began to settle heavily in her chest. The wind beat against the windows, rattling the glass and shaking the frame. Lori sat by the fire, staring into the flames, but her thoughts were far from the warmth in front of her. She hadn't been prepared for how quickly things were changing between her and Thatcher. In the beginning, their marriage had been nothing more than a cold, practical arrangement, a way to save the land, to hold on to the last thing that had been her father's. But as the days passed, as they shared quiet moments by the fire, as she watched him work without asking for anything in return, something inside Lori began to shift. She didn't know when it had happened or how, but she found herself looking at Thatcher differently now. There was a quiet steadiness to him that made her feel grounded, a calm that balanced out her own storm of thoughts and emotions. He wasn't like the men in the town, the ones who had always looked at her as if she was a challenge to be overcome or a prize to be won. Thatcher didn't look at her with expectation, didn't ask for anything from her but the bare minimum. And that, for some reason, made him different from everyone else she had known. Lori tried to fight the growing feelings inside of her. She had never needed anyone before, had prided herself on being independent, strong, and self-sufficient. But Thatcher was different. He made her feel safe in a way no one else had. and that terrified her. As the storm raged on outside, Lori could feel her thoughts beginning to spiral. She had lived alone for so long, had always taken care of herself, but now there was Thatcher, and she wasn't sure what that meant. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to know. But the storm outside seemed to mirror the storm in her heart, and as the wind howled and the snow piled up around the cabin, Lori couldn't help but wonder if she had already let herself care too much. The next day, when Thatcher came in from the storm, Lori could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He had been out there in the snow and wind, making sure the animals were safe, checking the barn, and tending to things that no one else would have thought about. She watched him as he stood in the doorway, shaking off the cold, his face reddened from the wind, his boots covered in snow. For a moment, their eyes met, and Lori felt a flicker of something deep inside her, something that had been growing quietly over the past few weeks. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Thatcher walked past her and toward the fire, but instead of sitting down, he paused. "You should have stayed inside," he said, his voice low and rough from the cold. "It's a bad storm." Lori swallowed hard, standing up from the chair by the fire. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain the feeling that had been building inside her. But the words wouldn't come. Thatcher turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What's going on, Lori?" he asked quietly. Lori didn't know how to answer. How could she explain the storm that had been swirling inside her heart? How could she tell him that everything was changing and that she didn't know how to stop it? Instead of answering, she just shook her head. But Thatcher wasn't going to let it go that easily. He stepped closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "You've been shutting me out," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "We've been living under the same roof, working side by side, but you're still so far away. What's going on?" Lori took a deep breath, her chest tightening as she struggled to find the words. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had been building inside her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she felt the tears well up in her eyes. She didn't know what was happening to her, why she was feeling so vulnerable, so exposed. Thatcher reached out, his hand gently cupping her face as he wiped away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice soft and steady. "You don't have to hide from me." Lori looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in weeks, she let herself feel the weight of everything, of the loss, of the land, of the loneliness, and of the growing bond between her and this man she barely knew. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been alone for so long. Thatcher, I don't know how to let anyone in." Thatcher's hand slid from her face to her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. "You don't have to do anything," he said softly. "You don't have to let me in if you're not ready. But I'm here, Lori. I'm here because I want to be." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lori felt the weight of his words sink into her chest, and in that silence, she realized something she hadn't let herself admit. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to be. The confession was small, but it was enough to change everything. Lori took a shaky breath and finally looked at Thatcher, really looked at him for the first time. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered. Thatcher stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Then you're not," he said, his voice low, almost a promise. He didn't ask her to explain, didn't push her to do anything she wasn't ready for. Instead, he just stood there, his presence a steady, calming force in the storm that raged both inside and outside the cabin. Lori didn't know what came next, or what the future held for them. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. And that was enough. The days following Lori and Thatcher's quiet confession were filled with a sense of change, though neither of them spoke about it directly. Lori still worked the land as she always had. But now there was something different in her movements, something lighter, as if the weight of the world had been slightly lifted from her shoulders. Thatcher, too, carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing Lori no longer stood alone. He was still the same man he had been when they first met, quiet and reserved, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now. The storm that had raged outside seemed to settle, and with it, something shifted inside the cabin. But as the days grew colder and Christmas approached, Lori began to feel a growing sense of unease. She knew that Christmas, a time for families to come together, would only highlight the fact that she had no family left. She had always managed to keep her distance from others, focusing only on the land, but the thought of spending another Christmas alone in the cabin made her heart ache. She had never wanted company, never wanted anyone to feel sorry for her. But this year, the idea of being alone again felt unbearable. Thatcher, as if sensing her inner turmoil, remained at the cabin more often. He had been out on the ranch most days, working, but now he was spending more time by the fire, working quietly beside her without asking for anything in return. Lori had grown used to his presence, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself looking forward to the quiet companionship they shared. He didn't ask her to talk, didn't demand anything from her. He just let her be. But the loneliness still lingered, gnawing at her, reminding her of the absence of her parents, of the family that had once filled the house with laughter and love. Thatcher noticed the change in her, the way she had started to withdraw again, retreating into herself as Christmas drew closer. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the sadness that she tried so hard to hide. He didn't know how to fix it, but he knew that she didn't have to face it alone. One night, after they had finished dinner, Thatcher stood up and walked over to the door, slipping his coat on. "Where are you going?" Lori asked, looking up from the fire. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, but his voice was steady. "I'm going to get something for you," he said simply. Lori frowned, confused. "For me? What are you talking about?" Thatcher didn't answer. He simply stepped out into the cold night, disappearing into the snow-covered landscape. Lori watched him go, a sense of uncertainty swirling in her chest. She didn't know what to make of it, but something about his calm certainty made her trust him, even if she didn't fully understand why. The hours passed slowly, the fire crackling and popping as Lori sat in the silence of the cabin, the weight of the upcoming holiday pressing down on her chest. She wasn't sure what Thatcher was doing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. She had always been so independent, so used to doing things on her own, but now, with Thatcher's quiet support, she was starting to realize that maybe she didn't have to do everything by herself. The night stretched on, and the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling through the trees. Lori pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to keep warm as she stared into the fire. She had never been one for holiday traditions, never cared much for the festivities that others seemed to look forward to so eagerly. But this year, things were different. This year, she felt the emptiness of the cabin more than she ever had before. The knock at the door startled her, breaking her thoughts. She stood up quickly, her heart racing. When she opened the door, she was greeted by the sight of Thatcher, standing in the doorway, covered in snow, his face flushed from the cold. In his hands, he held a bundle wrapped in rough cloth. "What is this?" Lori asked, her voice a little more frantic than she intended. Thatcher stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat and boots. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. Lori looked down at the bundle in his hands, her curiosity piqued. "Merry Christmas?" she repeated, still unsure of what was happening. Thatcher gently placed the bundle in her hands, his fingers brushing hers as he let go. Lori unwrapped it slowly, her breath catching as she revealed what was inside. It was a small wooden box, intricately carved with designs that looked old and worn, as though it had been passed down through generations. Lori looked up at Thatcher, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. "What is this?" she asked softly. Thatcher took a step closer, his voice steady and quiet. "It's for you," he said simply. "I don't have much to offer, Lori, but I know that this is something your father would have kept, something that belongs with you. Lori's heart pounded in her chest as she carefully lifted the lid of the box. Inside, she found an old, weathered photograph of her parents taken many years ago. The edges were frayed, and the photo had faded with time, but the faces of her mother and father were still recognizable. A small tear slipped down her cheek as she traced the image with her finger. She hadn't realized how much she missed them until now. "It's not much," Thatcher said, his voice almost apologetic, "but I thought it might help. I thought you might want to remember them." Lori looked up at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. She didn't know what to say. Words seemed insufficient, too small for the overwhelming wave of gratitude and sorrow that washed over her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thatcher didn't say anything in response. He simply watched her, his presence steady and warm as she sat down slowly by the fire. She clutched the box to her chest, the photograph inside more precious to her than anything she could have imagined. For the first time in a long while, Lori didn't feel entirely alone. Thatcher's quiet understanding, his willingness to offer something so personal, had touched her in a way she wasn't prepared for. The night wore on, the storm outside growing fiercer, but inside the cabin, there was a sense of peace. Lori didn't know what the future held, or what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face it alone. Thatcher was still there, by her side, quietly waiting for her to come to terms with her own feelings. As the night stretched on, the fire crackling in the hearth, Lori realized that what she had once feared the most, letting someone in, sharing her heart, wasn't as terrifying as she had imagined. With Thatcher's quiet patience, his understanding, and his willingness to offer her a piece of the past, Lori began to believe in the possibility of something more, something lasting. Maybe, she thought, Christmas wasn't just about family. It was about the people who choose to stand beside you, who offer warmth and kindness when the world feels cold. And maybe, just maybe, Thatcher Boone was the person she needed in her life.